Hello everyone. Today we are going to be looking at a small little comic that I made. It was during Margaret week, like the rest of them, that I've been doing. And it is, I think each page took me about 5 hours, and since that's 4 pages, it took me around 20 hours, which is how long the Margaret, Ophelia, and the other illustration of Margaret and Nordia took me. So yeah, this is a decent-sized video. So basically what I'm going to be talking about is Skyjacks, Campaign Skyjacks, which is what this comic is based off of, and sort of what is happening in the comic. I'm going to try not to spoil too much, and sort of how I made it, and how I felt while making it, and sort of the differences between making comics and other drawings. So this comic is a 4-page strip about the Campaign Skyjacks Nordia arc. And the Nordia arc takes place in the town Nordia, and what's currently happening during this comic is that there's a huge storm, and the enemy, I guess you could call them the big bad, is sort of wanting to attack. And Margaret and Travis, the two people in this comic, are trying to get back to everybody else, and help them either evacuate or fight the big bad. I feel like I'm being vague enough here, but I'm not quite sure. And so in this part of the comic is when there is the sort of steps that they need to go on are flooded to get to the higher part of town, and they have to try their best to either swim across or something like that. And Margaret's power sort of runs on intimacy. That's how she gets her magical power. And so then she, asks Travis to help her gain power to help them to, shield them to go across. And he just says, "I promise I won't let go of your hand," and that promise. And sort of all the emotional baggage that comes behind it, again, I don't want to spoil too much, gives Margaret a lot of magical power. And yeah, that's basically sort of what the comic's about. And since the week was Margaret week, I wanted to make the comic from Margaret's point of view, since Travis in the podcast, Travis is a player character, and Margaret is a, PC, played by the GM. And so then I wanted to do this from her point of view, because, a lot of times in RPG, either podcasts or even just, playing a game with your friends, oftentimes you don't get that much into what the NPCs are thinking throughout, especially throughout any sort of combat scenario. Oftentimes they are supports for the PCs or, the villains, obviously. So that's one thing that I think is really interesting, especially for things like, Critical Role, the Vox Machina TV show, or the Adventure Zone comics, or, the, Vox Machina Origin comics and things like that, is that you can sort of get more of an insight into the NPCs and sort of what they're thinking and what their role is. In specific parts, you get to, cut away from the party and see sort of what they're doing behind the scenes. That sort of makes those gears turn. And so, I made this sort of for Margaret's point of view and sort of what she's thinking about the situation and about Travis. Making a comic itself is very different from a regular illustration. I'm sure, especially if you've, drawn a comic and an illustration or both, you can understand how different those two things are. And I have made comics before, so I do know that. We do not speak of those old comics that I have made, however. We do not speak of them. But I have done them, and somehow they always feel like they take longer than other drawings, even though this took me about 20 hours, and the other illustrations took around the same time to make. But this felt longer, even though that was one illustration, and these are, 4 pages and a bunch of little different panels that obviously took me less time. Maybe it's because I had to, constantly go back to step 1, instead of constantly seeing the progress and, the detail and the effort that I put into those illustrations that take me so much time. And with this one, I constantly am making a bunch of little ones, so it's hard to see that progress, especially when you start a new page and you're immediately back to square one. That might be why, mentally it sort of feels a bit longer. Even though, this comic, I had a lot prepared for it. I had those character designs that I did of Travis and Margaret before this, and even then, I knew what Travis looked like. A lot of people have drawn him as well as Margaret, and there are descriptors of Margaret in the show. And the color palette I had gotten locked down throughout Margaret week. I used the same color palette sort of for time's sake. It was easy, and also I found one that I really liked, and I wanted to make all of them sort of look consistent with one another. And I sort of added to that color palette as I went. With this one, I added a few more blues, I believe, because, there was the water behind them that was in turmoil and it was raining, and I needed sort of different shades of blue than I had for that, because the blue that I had was a very nice, pretty blue, and for this I needed ones that were darker and more ominous and all of that. And the story and the dialogue I mostly took from the podcast itself. There were a couple of I think in the last page there were a couple thought bubbles from Margaret that I made up, and I might have reworded a couple of things because, in the middle of them talking, they're talking about mechanics and what Travis is thinking of the situation and all of that stuff. So, the scene, while it looks pretty short, took, I don't know, maybe it took 5 minutes in the episode, and they're talking about, what Travis is thinking, the other things that are going on currently, how they're going to get from point A to point B, when this is just mostly the dialogue between the two of them and how they're going to cross the river. And you don't quite get that sort of backstory, I guess, with them. But technically, design-wise, I do want to talk about these last couple of pages. I did add a lot more sort of ambient light to them as Margaret's power sort of it gets, I'm not sure what the proper term is, charged. She, from the promise that Travis is making to her, she gets more powerful. So then that's sort of where the ambient light and the, butterflies come in. And you can also see, it's something that they talked about, the sort of red string on their fingers. That's another way that Margaret's power manifests, because it's sort of a power of, connection in a relationship with another person. I'm sure you've heard of the, red string of fate on two people's pinky, sort of like that soulmate thing. That's sort of where that's drawn from. And after making this comic, I was sort of burnt out from not drawing, but just making comics in general. It's not something that I do often, and every time I do it, I'm like, oh my gosh, why would I do that? But at the same time, there's always this sort of pull that comics has on me. I always, love reading them. I got Webtoons Tapas, 4 different, webcomic apps on my phone. And I read them all the time, and I love them. And, I've always thought to myself, one day I'll make one. And then every time I make a comic, a few pages in, I'm like, I want to work on something else. So it's very impressive, and I have the utmost respect for people who are able to work on something consistently for years and years. That's absolutely incredible to me. I would love to have that kind of discipline, and obviously the only way to get that kind of discipline would be to actually make a comic, which, like I said, is something that I'm like, oh, maybe someday. And once again, I think maybe someday. There are many different things that I want to make and do before I would be able to have the commitment of time and effort to make a comic. But you can see I do sort of have the comic mindset for this, where I oftentimes copy and paste and reuse and recycle, since they're in the same place. But I know that one of the big ways to do that, I saw this specifically on Drawfee, the one episode where Julia uses Blender and everybody freaks out, is absolutely incredible. But I was looking at that and I'm like, yeah, that's it. That would be a really smart thing to do, is to just, if a lot of things in your comic happen in one specific place, to just make a 3D model in Blender of it, and then you would just have to take a picture or screenshot of that specific angle that you want, and then just trace it. And that would be so incredibly smart and useful. I would have to learn how to use Blender, but I think for a series of illustrations that I have not planned, but an idea for, I feel like that would be really nice, because I want to have a series of illustrations in the same room. And I feel like that would be very beneficial, to just have a Blender 3D model and then just change the angle. It would definitely help with consistency and my sanity. Especially since I like to add so many details to the backgrounds of things that I like to draw. Yeah, and you can see here specifically when sort of the promise is made, you can see the little glowy butterflies and the ambient light really starts to get pushed a lot further than in any of the drawings. And then in the fourth one, it's the brightest. And then here's the last one where you get into Margaret's thought process more, which you don't get in the podcast, at least Skyjacks. I'm not sure about. There are a couple of things on Patreon that OneShot Podcast has that has Margaret in it more. I haven't watched those, but I would like to. I'm actually a little bit behind Skyjacks because I've been binging a couple of other things. Specifically Campaign Star Wars, which is the campaign that they did before Skyjacks, which was a Star Wars one where they used the same system, Genesis. I don't think it was called Genesis back then, but I'm not sure. But yeah, this one it sort of gets more you can see in the middle there, like it gets the frames of the comic themselves get a bit more organic because she's sort of like remembering things. Again, I don't want to spoil too much, but you can see her sort of like perception of things is sort of like being not warped but changed, and that's sort of what I wanted to convey in like the frames of the comic. And yeah, and also once again I copied and pasted a lot of different things, specifically like Travis in those middle ones, and I copied and pasted Margaret, but then I changed her expression a little bit, and then like the hands from there I copied and pasted from the first and the last frame, and so if you're trying to make a comic and you're struggling, don't be afraid to copy and paste and reuse and take shortcuts, because if you don't, then you'll burn yourself out and you'll never finish. Actual professional web comic and comic artists do that all the time, and obviously there are many accounts on YouTube and artists everywhere that share their work that are much more knowledgeable about that stuff than I am. But yeah, and then also for this, I believe I also made a font of my handwriting. There's a website where you can do that, where you just sort of plug in, there's like a template you can download, and then you put your handwriting in there, and then you re-upload it onto the website, and then they make a font that you can download out of it. Yeah, I did have to change the sort of tracking and letting of the letters a lot. That's not something that was really well done, but it's really easy and simple and really fun to sort of make a font out of your own handwriting. It was super cool, but if you want to do that, just keep in mind you'll probably have to adjust it, sort of sentence by sentence and word by word, if you want to use it for a comic or anything like that. yeah, but I wanted to use the font because I wanted something handwritten that sort of looked similar to the line art, so I used the same brush as the line art, but then I wanted it to look consistent and like a comic handwritten font. So I figured the best way to do that was to have consistent letters, which is where the font came in handy, because, we use the exact same A versus, like, every time you write an A, it'll look slightly different. So, yeah, and you can see right here, how there is a bunch more, sort of ambient light, and, like, all the little glowy little butterflies that, it's not canon in the podcast, but I just thought it looked very beautiful, is sort of the, visual motif of Margaret's power, along with the, red string that connects her to people. So oftentimes in the specific, drawings that I made specifically of Margaret as the maiden, I had sort of like the little butterflies landing on the red string, and I just thought that looked very visually interesting. And yeah, so here are all of the comic pages, and that's it. I hope you have a wonderful day, and you're able to make that comic that you want to make. Goodbye.